He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't move. For weeks, the German shepherd just cowered in the corner, until one broken man whispered a single word, and everything changed. But how did a military working dog, presumed lost in Afghanistan, end up hiding in a ghost town kennel in Tennessee? This reunion will shatter you, and what happens next is even more shocking than the rescue itself. Drop a comment if this story made your heart stop, and don't forget to subscribe for more true animal miracles. Marrow Creek, Tennessee, wasn't the kind of place that made headlines. It was tucked in a basin of weathered limestone cliffs, old pine groves, and a string of shuttered mining towns that had long since gone quiet. By early November, the wind here cut like a blade through the hollows, stirring up red dust and brittle leaves. The sky had turned the color of wet ash, and the air smelled faintly of stone and cold iron. It was the kind of place where forgotten things stayed forgotten until something or someone refused to be. Mason Ellwood had not planned on coming back here. Not to the old cement plant turned animal shelter. Not to the gravel lots where he'd once taught dogs to find the living buried beneath rubble and snow. But life after loss didn't move in straight lines. It looped and backtracked, pulling you into places you thought you'd buried with the dead. Mason was a tall man, broad-shouldered with the remnants of a soldier's posture, though his frame had grown leaner in recent years. His hair, once dark, had gone salt and pepper too early, a match for the peppered stubble on his chin. He wore a flannel shirt, jeans faded from honest use, and a jacket one size too big, perhaps once meant for someone else. His eyes were a stormy gray, and when he smiled, which wasn't often, it looked like muscle memory more than joy. Mason hadn't smiled since Emily died. His wife had been everything light in a world built from dust and noise. A climber, a laugh-out-loud kind of soul, she'd fallen to her death on a ridge in Utah 3 years ago. Mason had tried to bury her memory under miles of highway, under bottles and silence, and most recently, under the hood of the old pickup he was about to donate. He parked outside the shelter and left the engine running for a moment. The wind rattled through the broken chain-link fencing near the main gate. Beyond it, the shelter loomed, a gray slab of weather-beaten concrete repurposed with plywood signs and poorly insulated windows. It was called Second Chance Haven, but to Mason, it looked like a halfway house for ghosts. He stepped out and met the eyes of Sarah Boone, the shelter manager. Sarah was in her mid-50s, with short, sandy hair always pinned back with a pencil. She was tall and wiry, with a strength that came from years of lifting things heavier than herself. Dogs, crates, grief. Her features were sharp, softened only by the crow's feet at the corners of her eyes. Sarah had a no-nonsense way of speaking, but beneath that was someone who'd carried too much alone. Her son, a firefighter, had died in a building collapse in Memphis 8 years ago. Since then, she'd spoken more to dogs than to people. "You actually showed up," she said, wiping her hands on a threadbare towel as she emerged from the side entrance. "I thought you might change your mind." "Truck still runs," Mason said. "Better someone put it to use." "You doing this for tax write-off or redemption?" "Neither," he replied, tossing her the keys. Sarah caught them without looking. "We're full up. Had another intake this morning. German shepherd. Won't eat. Won't move. Been with us 3 weeks. We're running out of time." Mason didn't ask why she told him that. He knew her tells. It wasn't a plea. It was a challenge. Sarah led him through the building, her boots echoing on the cold concrete floors. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly above, buzzing like nervous insects. The kennels were mostly occupied. Dogs of all kinds barked, howled, or whimpered as they passed. But one pen, third from the end on the right, was different. No sound, no movement. "This one," Sarah said quietly, stopping short. Mason stepped forward, peering through the scratched glass of the kennel door. At first, he thought it was empty. Then he saw it, a shape huddled so tight into the back corner it might have been a pile of old coats. But then it shifted. The dog was a German shepherd, maybe 4 or 5 years old, though it was hard to tell beneath the gauntness. His fur was mottled black and tan, dulled with dirt and neglect. His ears twitched at the slightest movement, and his body language screamed something beyond fear. It was shut down, complete withdrawal. The dog pressed into the wall as if trying to disappear into it. "That's Atlas," Sarah said, not looking at the animal. "Name the vet gave him. Found in a drainage pipe near the quarry. Collar embedded in his neck. Had to cut it out. Won't take food unless we leave it and walk away." Mason stared at the dog for a long time. Atlas opened one eye. Just one. A single flicker of amber that met Mason's gaze. Not in curiosity, not even in hope. It was resignation, but it was aware, and that awareness struck something in Mason like a match to dry pine. 3 weeks? Mason asked, his voice low. 4 if you count the day animal control left him here and bailed. Nobody touches him. Not even me. Mason knelt slowly, not too close, his knees popping. He wasn't sure why he did it. He hadn't touched a working dog in nearly 2 years. Hadn't wanted to. But Atlas had that look, the kind that said, "I've seen too much and I don't want you near me, but if you stay long enough, maybe I won't disappear." And Mason stayed. He didn't speak. He didn't offer his hand. He just let the silence settle like snow between them. After a full minute, Atlas blinked. It was barely perceptible, but Mason saw it. Then the dog tucked his nose further beneath his chest and began to tremble. "Jesus," Mason whispered. "He's broken," Sarah said, not without feeling. "And we don't fix broken. We manage it." For a while, Mason stood, brushing dust off his jeans. "Can I come back tomorrow?" he asked. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What for?" "I don't know," Mason said. "But I think he looked at me." The cold in Marrow Creek didn't lift by morning. A gray fog clung low across the pines, blanketing the roads in a hush that made the town seem half forgotten by time itself. Frost crept along the window panes of the shelter as Mason Ellwood pulled into the gravel lot just past 7 a.m., his breath fogging the inside of the borrowed county truck. He had told himself a dozen times on the way there that he didn't need to be doing this. He wasn't a part of this place anymore. But the image of Atlas pressed into the corner of that cage had taken root in him like a splinter beneath the skin. Inside, the shelter was quiet, save for the low hum of heating units and the occasional yip of a restless dog. Sarah Boone met him near the kennels, holding a clipboard in one hand and a coffee in the other. Her flannel jacket hung open over a faded sweatshirt, and her expression was unreadable. Mason had known Sarah long enough to recognize her brand of silent hope. It looked a lot like skepticism. "You're early," she said without lifting her eyes from the paperwork. "Couldn't sleep," Mason replied simply. She nodded, motioning toward the far row. "He hasn't moved much since you left. Barely touched his food again. Don't expect a miracle." "I never do." Atlas was still in the corner when Mason approached. His posture remained tightly coiled, but his eyes tracked Mason's movement as he entered. That was new. Yesterday, the dog hadn't flinched, hadn't even acknowledged him until the very end. Today, there was something more awake behind those eyes. A faint tremor of awareness. Mason sat down slowly, just outside the kennel, back to the wall, mimicking the posture he had taken the previous day. He didn't speak. He didn't move. For 20 minutes, he simply let the stillness fill the space between them. And gradually, ever so slowly, Atlas began to shift. A front paw inched forward. His head turned, not fully, but just enough to mark Mason's presence without fear. Not progress, exactly, but perhaps a question. The silence was broken by a light shuffle of footsteps from the back hallway. A girl's voice followed, quiet but certain. "Is that him?" Mason looked up. A young girl stood beside Sarah at the far end of the corridor, watching intently. She was about 12, tall for her age, with long limbs and a narrow frame that still moved like she was unsure how to inhabit it. Her hair was a deep russet, braided loosely over one shoulder, and freckles dusted her pale cheeks. She wore a worn green hoodie 2 sizes too big and jeans with a rip at the knee. There was a steadiness in her gaze that surprised Mason. Mature, perceptive, but not hardened. "Sierra," Sarah said, her voice softer than usual. "This is Mason. Mason, my daughter." Sierra Maynard stepped forward, not with the awkwardness of a child meeting a stranger, but with the composed gait of someone used to entering quiet spaces. She crouched beside Mason without hesitation, her eyes never leaving Atlas. The dog had stilled again, but his ears twitched. He was watching her. "He's not afraid of me," Sierra said after a moment. "I've walked past his cage before. The others bark. He just looks. Maybe you're the quiet type too," Mason murmured, not taking his eyes off Atlas. Sierra shrugged, used to animals listening better than people. She didn't elaborate, and Mason didn't press. But Sarah's eyes flickered with something unspoken as she folded her arms. The room felt thick with stories no one wanted to tell. Later that morning, while Mason helped move a heavy crate in the back supply room, Sarah lingered by the door and finally spoke. "She thinks Atlas knew her brother," she said, her voice low. "Noah. He was a Marine. Missing 3 years now. Declared Kia, but she never believed it. Holds onto anything that feels familiar." Mason looked up, surprised. "You let her come here often?" "She insists. Helps feed the small dogs. Reads to the puppies in the afternoons. It's the only thing that gets her talking some days." Sarah looked down. "I don't know if she sees ghosts or just needs one to talk back." That afternoon, Mason returned to Atlas's kennel alone. He brought a worn leather tug toy, not to tempt play, but to leave nearby, a gesture, something familiar. He set it just within sight of the dog's gaze and backed off. Atlas didn't approach, but his eyes lingered on the object. Hours passed. The wind outside rattled the shelter's metal doors, and the fog never quite lifted. Mason stood near the hallway window, arms crossed, debating whether to head out when a voice startled him. I think he remembers. Sierra was there again, leaning against the doorway with a sketchbook tucked beneath her arm. She walked to the kennel, knelt down, and gently slid a small drawing under the bars. It was a child's rendering of a Marine in uniform standing beside a dog. Atlas, unmistakable in his posture. Noah had a dog, trained with one in Quantico before deployment. He sent me pictures. I think Atlas is that dog. That's a long shot, Mason said, not unkindly. I know, Sierra said, her voice quiet but sure. But he looks at me like he used to look at Noah in the photos. Like I matter. Mason didn't reply. He looked at Atlas, who had shifted just enough to rest his head on his paws, still watching the girl. That night, as Mason left the shelter, he passed the old quarry on the edge of town. The road curled around the cliffs like a broken ribbon, the rocks high and jagged beneath the cloudy sky. For a second, he thought he heard something, a low whimper in the distance, but it was probably just the wind. Still, he didn't stop thinking about it all the way home. The days in Marrow Creek had begun to shorten. By late afternoon, shadows stretched long across the gravel lots and pine-thick ridges, soaking the world in a dull amber haze. The cold settled early, clinging to the sides of old brick buildings and creeping beneath door frames with icy fingers. Inside the shelter, the overhead lights flickered reluctantly to life, casting the kennels in a tired, industrial glow. Mason Ellwood leaned against the metal gate of Atlas's kennel, arms crossed, watching the dog from a distance of 6 feet. The German shepherd had shifted from his far corner and now lay in the middle of the space, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. The dog had begun to tolerate Mason's presence, neither cowering nor growling, but the space between them was still thick with a fragile, unspoken line. Atlas wasn't submitting. He was enduring, and Mason recognized that kind of endurance all too well. It was the same sort of stillness he'd seen in soldiers fresh from trauma, where obedience had given way to emotional paralysis, where instincts lingered but the heart no longer followed. That morning, something subtle had caught Mason's attention. When he dropped a folded towel into the kennel, Atlas didn't flinch. But as Mason's hand brushed the latch, the dog's ears twitched. Not in fear, but in recognition. His body stiffened, not with anxiety, but as if bracing for command. It was the same flinch response Mason had drilled into countless working dogs in the past. Muscle memory, trained reaction. Mason knelt, slowly, and tested it. He tapped twice on the bars in a soft rhythm. Atlas blinked, ears rising. Then Mason gave a low, deliberate whistle, 3 notes descending. It had once been the recall cue for military canines under his supervision. Atlas's breath hitched. His body rose an inch, then deflated. No movement. But the cue had landed. That was no backyard stray. Atlas had been trained. The realization brought a heaviness Mason had tried to leave buried. He stood, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He hadn't asked for this. He didn't want to remember what it felt like to speak in whistles and hand signals, to trust a dog more than a man. But Atlas wasn't going to let him ignore it. Later that afternoon, Mason retreated to the staff break room, a narrow space with a dented vending machine and a kettle that groaned when used. Sarah Boone sat at the fold-out table, reviewing intake reports. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable as always. "You're still here," she said. "Looks like I am." Sarah pushed a mug toward him. "Black coffee. No sugar, no milk. The same way Emily used to drink it." "I gave him the recall signal," Mason said flatly. "Military standard." He reacted. Sarah didn't respond right away. Her brow tightened slightly. "That explains some things," she said at last. "We've had dogs before with that kind of training. Never this broken, though." Mason looked at her. "He's not broken. Just lost." Sarah's lips tightened. "Aren't we all?" The door creaked open then, interrupting the silence. Sierra stepped in, her arms full of laundry, blankets freshly cleaned and still warm. She moved like she belonged here, a quiet rhythm in the background of every day. Her presence was a comfort Mason hadn't expected to notice. Sierra dumped the blankets in the basket by the dryer and turned to leave, then paused. "Can I show you something?" she asked Mason. He blinked. "Sure." She led him down the corridor to the volunteer locker room, her sneakers squeaking softly against the tile. From her backpack, she pulled out a small tin box, battered, dented, and covered in faded marine stickers. "I keep stuff in here," she said. "Noah's stuff." She opened the box with gentle fingers. Inside were old letters, a military patch, a photo of Sierra with a tall, laughing young man in fatigues, Noah, and a worn leather cord with a rusted piece of metal attached. She handed Mason the object. It was a fragment of a military unit badge, twisted and scuffed. On the underside, barely legible, was stamped PX 119. "I found it yesterday," Sierra said, wedged under Atlas's old collar, where the stitching frayed. Mason turned the piece over, reading the number again. His heart slowed. "That's a unit designation," he murmured. "PX is Field Reconnaissance." 119 was a canine-assisted team out of Quantico. Noah was assigned there, Sierra whispered. Before his second tour. Mason stared at her, suddenly unsure of how much of this was coincidence and how much was something else entirely. "I think Atlas was Noah's dog," she said, voice trembling. "That's a hell of a leap." Sierra bit her lip. "Maybe, but he looks at me like he knows me. Like I matter, not just someone walking by." Mason handed the tag back gently. He didn't want to believe it, didn't want to be pulled into that kind of hope. But Atlas's response to the cue, the badge, Sierra's uncanny bond. "I believe you," he said quietly. Sierra's eyes filled with tears. She didn't cry, but her body seemed to relax, just for a moment, as if someone had finally lifted a weight from her chest. From the hallway, a voice called out, deep, slightly hoarse. "You folks see my daughter?" It was the first time Mason met Rick Maynard, Sierra's father. Rick was in his late 40s, burly with a sun-beaten face, hair cut short and streaked with gray. He wore a brown work jacket and heavy boots, the kind worn by men who worked outside, no matter the weather. His eyes were sharp, watchful, but not unkind. There was a wariness about him, like someone always bracing for bad news. "Hey, Dad," Sierra said, snapping the tin shut. Rick gave Mason a firm nod. "You the dog guy?" "Not anymore," Mason replied. "Well, my girl thinks different. Says you're the only one listening. She's worth listening to." Rick considered him for a beat, then smiled faintly. "Good answer." He placed a hand on Sierra's shoulder, nodded at Mason again, and led her back toward the truck outside. Mason lingered in the doorway a long time after they left. The badge still burned in his mind. That evening, after the shelter closed, Mason returned to Atlas's kennel. The dog stood as he approached, not fully, but enough to meet his eyes head-on. Mason knelt and placed the badge inside the kennel, just within reach. Atlas sniffed it, then lay down, his paw resting protectively over the small piece of metal. The wind swept through Marrow Creek with a sharpness that sliced between the ribs. Clouds hung low, thick as slate, casting the Quarry cliffs in pale shadow. The skeletal remains of the once booming limestone operation now loomed like forgotten ruins, tall scaffolds rusting beneath the weight of time and moss. Conveyor belts curled into decay, silence filling every crevice once rattled by stone. Mason Ellwood stood at the edge of the drop, hands in his jacket pockets, the PX 119 badge still etched into his thoughts. It had been 3 days since Sierra had handed him the broken tag. 3 days of quiet intensity, watching Atlas grow more alert, more present, as if his memory stirred with every moment spent in proximity to the girl who spoke gently and waited without pressure. And in those 3 days, Mason had made a call he'd never wanted to make, to a man he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. That morning, the call had finally been returned. At the edge of the quarry now stood a rust-colored Jeep with the words Veteran Canine Division, Federal Registry Access, stenciled along the door. Leaning against it, arms crossed, was Raymond Brick Halvorsen, former Master Sergeant turned dog unit archivist. Brick was broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, his thick neck connecting squarely to a shaved head that caught the gray light like worn steel. His face was a roadmap of sun damage, scarred beneath the left eye, and his tone carried the gravel of too many years yelling over helicopter blades. Brick flicked a toothpick from his mouth as Mason approached. "Still got the shoulders," he grunted, nodding toward Mason's posture. "But you've aged like hell." "Mirror tells me the same," Mason said. "Thanks for coming." Brick handed him a folded document sealed in a clear sleeve. "You were right to ask. PX 119. The last handler of record was Sergeant Noah Maynard, MWD program, Kandahar Sector 3. Dog's call sign was Reaper, but the nickname logged by the handler was," he paused, tapping the page, "Atlas." Mason felt his breath press flat in his chest. He was classified Tier 2 Tactical, Brick added, trained for remote recon, SEN ID, and explosive location. Top his class. Records show he was with Maynard during an IED detonation. Maynard was declared Kia on scene. Dog was recovered 3 days later by a civilian patrol in the green zone, wounded but alive. And then, Mason asked quietly, transferred stateside for psych assessment, cleared for adoption, but flagged as emotionally unstable. Didn't pass 2 civilian trials. Paper trail ends in a county shelter near Amarillo. My guess is he was handed off, lost again. Ended up here. Mason stared across the quarry pit, processing the enormity of it. "And Maynard?" he finally asked. "No confirmed body," Brick said. "Just blood evidence and blast radius. Typical bureaucratic wrap-up." But he paused, tugging at the collar of his coat. Something about the case always fell off. Clean file, too clean. No follow-up, no canine retirement entry. It's like someone forgot to close the book. Mason was quiet for a moment. The sky above turned grayer, heavier. Brick glanced at him sidelong. "You're not just asking for records, are you?" "No," Mason said. "I'm asking if there's any way Noah's still alive." Brick scratched his jaw. "If he is, he's deep off-grid. But dogs remember. And if Atlas is responding like you say, maybe he knows something we don't." They stood in silence, wind curling up from the quarry below. "What do you want to do?" Brick finally asked. Mason turned toward the shelter in the distance. "I think it's time we stop pretending they're just ghosts." That evening, Mason returned to Second Chance Haven, the shelter unusually quiet. Sarah was gone for the day, and the volunteer crew had already clocked out. In the back corridor, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, Atlas lay calmly behind the kennel door. Mason opened the latch and stepped inside. It was the first time he'd done so without hesitation. Atlas lifted his head, body tense, but not retreating. Mason knelt and held out the same toy he'd left days ago, now scented faintly with Sierra's jacket. Atlas sniffed, then took it gently from Mason's hand. For a long second, the two of them stayed like that, 2 survivors learning how to be near someone again. From the front door, there was a knock. Sierra stood there, a backpack slung over one shoulder, cheeks pink from the cold. "I brought the photo," she said quietly, holding out an envelope. Inside was a print. Noah in uniform, crouched beside a younger Atlas. The dog looked directly into the lens, his ears forward, body relaxed, trust radiating from every line. Mason knelt and held the photo in front of Atlas. The shepherd stilled. His ears pricked forward. Then his eyes flicked to Sierra, and for the first time his tail moved. A low, hesitant wag. The following Saturday came with a brittle sky, streaked in faded blue and cloudless for once. Frost clung to the rooftops and power lines like dusted sugar, and the air held that peculiar stillness found only on mornings where something was about to shift. At Second Chance Haven, Mason arrived early. He had been up since before dawn, thoughts too loud for sleep, his body running on a rhythm that had returned uninvited, mission mode. Atlas had continued to show small but undeniable signs of awakening. Each day he grew more alert, more responsive, not just to Mason or Sierra, but to his surroundings. The kennel no longer felt like a coffin. It had become a perimeter, a watch post. Mason had prepared for today with care. In his bag, he carried something he hadn't touched in years, a Bluetooth field speaker used in early-stage K9 training. It was compact, matte black, and slightly scratched along the edges. In it, he had uploaded a collection of old training audio, environmental samples, battlefield recordings, field calls, and handler commands. Not to provoke fear, to observe memory. He found Sierra already waiting in the hallway outside Atlas's kennel, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a small, battered MP3 player in her lap. Her cheeks were flushed from the walk, her coat half-buttoned, red wool scarf wound loosely around her neck. The quiet in her posture was different today, not sad but expectant. "I brought it," she said, holding out the device like a fragile relic. "There's a recording on here. It's Noah. He sent it to me from the base, just a message. I used to listen to it every night when I couldn't sleep." Mason nodded once, slowly. "We'll play it last." They brought Atlas into the enclosed evaluation room, a space normally reserved for dogs preparing for behavioral testing. It had padded floors, neutral lighting, and sound-dampening walls. Atlas walked on his own leash, calm, but hyper-aware, muscles tight under his coat. He no longer dragged his paws or flinched for movement, but his steps were deliberate, like someone scanning for landmines. Sarah Boone stood behind the reinforced glass of the observation panel. She hadn't said much lately, watching Mason's strange involvement with quiet suspicion, but not interference. Her long frame, wrapped in a thick brown cardigan, was stiff, arms folded across her chest. A clipboard dangled at her side, mostly untouched. She was here today, not as director, but as mother to a daughter carrying too much invisible weight. Inside the room, Mason placed the Bluetooth speaker on the floor. He started with the basics. A soft military whistle played once. Atlas looked up. The tail twitched. Next, an ambient track, desert wind, distant rotors, muted radio chatter. Atlas froze, ears locked forward. Still no fear, just recognition. Mason glanced at Sierra. She was clutching her MP3 player, so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. "Now," he said gently. She clicked play. The voice crackled to life. Slightly distorted, recorded hastily, but still clear. "Hey, kiddo, if you're hearing this, it means I finally got the battery to work in this thing. Base is crazy right now, but we're okay. Atlas is being a goof. Knocked over the water bucket again. He still hates birds. Anyway, I miss you. Keep drawing. I'll be home before you know it." The moment the voice filled the room, Atlas snapped upright. The leash tightened in Mason's hands. The dog let out a low, guttural whine, then a whimper, and then a sharp, keening sound, one not born of fear, but longing. Atlas lunged forward, not violently, but with sudden urgency, nose pressed against the crack beneath the door. His body trembled, tail rigid, breath coming fast and shallow. He let out a long, rising howl, mournful, almost human, a call through space, through memory. Mason dropped to one knee, hand on Atlas's shoulder. "Easy," he whispered. "You know that voice, don't you?" Sierra knelt beside him, tears filling her eyes, and reached out. Atlas didn't flinch. His head turned toward her, ears flat, and for the first time he stepped toward her, a single, purposeful step, and nudged her palm with his nose. Sarah, watching through the glass, had covered her mouth. Her shoulders shook. Mason rose and muted the speaker. The room fell into silence. Atlas now sitting beside Sierra, eyes fixed on the dark speaker box like it might still carry his partner's scent. "He remembers," Sierra said softly. "No," Mason said. He never forgot. They stayed in the room for an hour, Atlas eventually curling beside Sierra's legs, body relaxed, eyes watchful. Something had shifted. A dam had cracked. Mason knew dogs well enough to know the difference between panic and recognition. This had been neither. This had been grief meeting hope. That evening, as the shelter began to shut down, Mason sat alone in his truck outside the old quarry again. His hands were tight on the wheel, the PX 119 tag hanging from the rearview mirror like a talisman. He pulled out his phone and made a second call to Brick Halvorson. "Brick," he said, voice rough, "we need to recheck Noah Maynard's records. Something's wrong with that file." Atlas heard his voice, reacted like he was still out there. There was a pause on the line. Then Brick's gravelly voice, "Give me 24 hours. I'll dig where they don't want us to." As Mason hung up, he looked out over the empty quarry, the wind howling softly through the stone. Somewhere out there, pieces of a story had been scattered and buried. But Atlas had remembered, and that meant the story wasn't over yet. The road to the hidden sanctuary was long and winding, carved through the Tennessee highlands where the trees grew denser and the silence heavier. The map Brick had provided led Mason and Sierra down an unmarked trail past faded mile markers and rusting signs. It wasn't a place you stumbled upon. It was a place people went to disappear. The facility sat tucked behind a grove of pines, surrounded by a simple wooden fence and a pair of gates made from salvaged military steel. There was no name, no welcome sign, just a mailbox marked Red Oak and a silence that spoke of old pain and hard healing. Mason pulled the truck to a stop. Atlas stood in the back seat, alert but calm, ears high, eyes fixed on the narrow cabin ahead. His coat had begun to regain its sheen, his frame now solid and strong. But today, he vibrated with something else, recognition. Sierra sat beside him, holding the photograph of her brother. She was still, her freckles pale against the winter light. But her hands trembled slightly, and Mason noticed she hadn't said a word since they left the highway. Her breath steamed against the glass as she exhaled slowly. The front door of the cabin opened. A man stepped out, limping slightly. He wore loose work pants and a flannel jacket, his short brown hair peppered with gray. His beard was patchy and overgrown, and a long scar traced the side of his jaw. But it was the eyes that caught Mason, the color, the shape, so unmistakably Sierra's. Noah Maynard stood like someone used to bracing for things that never came. His frame was solid, but the way he held himself told Mason everything. This man had known fire, and for a long time, he had not expected rescue. The caretaker stepped out behind him, Reverend Cal Kinney, the man who ran Red Oak. Kinney was in his 60s, medium height, thick-set, with a weather-beaten face and a voice like soft gravel. A former Navy chaplain, now retired, he had opened Red Oak 10 years earlier for veterans who couldn't go back, men who lived in the shadow of missing records, misdiagnoses, and the bureaucratic silence that followed trauma. "We don't ask questions here," Kinney had told Mason over the phone, "but we never turn away a man in need." Noah squinted toward the truck as Mason opened the door and stepped out. "I was told someone was coming," he said slowly. His voice had a cautious steadiness, but a strange weight trembled beneath it. Sierra opened her door and stepped onto the gravel, her breath catching. "Noah," she whispered. He turned. His face didn't change at first. No spark of memory, but something in his posture shifted. Recognition wasn't always immediate. It came in waves, in gestures, in voices. Mason opened the back door and let Atlas down. The moment the shepherd's paws touched the ground, his head turned sharply toward Noah. His body froze. The air itself held its breath. Then Atlas moved. Not a sprint, not a charge, a determined walk that grew faster, more desperate, until he was a blur. His claws scratched against the gravel as he threw himself forward and crashed into Noah's chest, nearly toppling him. A strangled sound came from deep inside the dog's throat, half growl, half cry, as if his soul had just come unmoored. Noah staggered, his arms instinctively wrapping around the thick fur, as if he'd done it 100 times before. His hands gripped Atlas's sides, his eyes wide and unblinking. Then his voice broke. "Home." Atlas whimpered and barked at once, licking his face, pressing against him like he wanted to disappear into his skin. Noah sank to his knees, arms around the shepherd's neck, and buried his face in the dog's fur. Sierra collapsed beside them, clutching the photograph, tears streaking down her cheeks in silence. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Mason stood a few steps back, his chest heavy, his throat thick. For a long time, none of them moved. Not the dog, not the brother, not the girl. Just the wind through the pines, soft and reverent. They stayed at Red Oak for the night. Inside the simple common room, lit by a fire and the soft hum of old speakers playing vinyl, Reverend Kinney explained the gaps. Noah had been brought in by a medical evac transport that never filed a formal reentry report. His dog had vanished. His identification had been burned beyond legibility. No one asked questions. Noah had arrived, shaken, broken, with fragments of memory and a tendency to wake screaming. For a while, Kinney hadn't known his name. Just a man haunted by someone, or something he couldn't name. Then about 2 weeks ago, Kinney said, sipping black tea, he started dreaming about a shepherd. A scar over the left shoulder. He'd wake crying out, calling Atlas into the dark. Noah sat nearby, legs folded beneath him, Atlas's head resting in his lap. His eyes were red, but the tension in his jaw had eased. His fingers absent-mindedly ran through the thick fur. He was no longer bracing. "I remembered pieces," he said. "Flashes. But it wasn't real until I heard Sierra's voice. And his scent. You're not the only one who was lost," Mason said softly. "You both survived. Just took a while to find your way back." Weeks passed. Mason returned to Marrow Creek and began drawing up plans. With Sarah Boone's help and Kinney's blessing, Mason repurposed a section of the shelters and used land to begin construction of a new facility. Hollow Creek Resilience Center, dedicated to pairing retired or displaced service dogs with veterans in need of therapy, connection, and purpose. Sierra volunteered daily, organizing supplies, writing journals for the dogs, sketching each one's portrait by hand. Noah, still healing, began working part-time with Mason, relearning the world, rebuilding trust. Together, they trained both dogs and people how to listen again. As for Atlas, he became the quiet guardian of the place. A living legend. No longer the creature cowering in the shadows, but the heart of the center. He would lie by the doors each morning, waiting for the next broken soul to arrive. And when they did, he would greet them with calm eyes and a steady presence, as if to say, "I made it. You can too." Life doesn't always give us clear answers. Sometimes it hands us broken pieces, fragments of memory, of loyalty, of hope, and waits to see what we'll do with them. This story reminds us that healing doesn't happen alone. It happens in the quiet moments of trust, in the soft return of recognition, and in the hearts that refuse to give up on animals, on people, on love itself. In our own lives, maybe we felt like Atlas, lost, afraid, unsure if anyone will ever find us. Or maybe we've been like Sierra, holding on to hope even when the world calls it foolish. But somewhere out there, healing is waiting for all of us. And sometimes, all it takes is one voice, one step, one word like home to lead us back. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that light can return even in the darkest places. Leave a comment below, tell us your story, or simply type them in to send love to all those still searching for their way home. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that bring hope, healing, and humanity to life. And may God bless each of you, wherever your journey finds you tonight.